This means that Africa consumes on 1/3 of its production despite the prevalent challenges of energy availability, accessibility, and affordability. These facts highlight some of the potential opportunities that exist for Africa, not only in production of oil and gas, but also in the processing and utilization within the continent for improvement in the standard of living. Only 3 weeks ago, if I am right, the UK government decided to give out 100 mining leases in the North Sea. Yet today, we're talking about laws that should prevent us from doing what we're doing. Sustainable local content practice represents the surest route to achieve in-country value addition to maximize the benefit of exploitation of hydrocarbon resources. The quantum of composite value added to are created in the local economy by a systematic development of capacity and capabilities through deliberate utilization of local human, material resources and services. The practice of local content in the oil and gas industry, and indeed any sector, entails the employment of 6 key parameters as follows: regulatory framework, gap analysis, I think somebody talked about it, capacity building, funding and incentives, research and development, as well as access to market. In the next few slides, I'll briefly describe each of these parameters, the achievements we have so far realized in Nigeria, and the lessons we have learned in the process. The whole idea is to ensure that Namibia does not make the mistakes that we made. Namibia does not get into the pit hole that we found ourselves for 50 years, that we are being told, if you have enact the Local Content Act, the whole world will collapse. We have operated it for almost 12 years successfully, and we have developed Nigerian capabilities. The first parameter for any world-class local content structure is a regulatory framework. An enabling regulatory framework backed with the appropriate legislation is very fundamental in local content practice. A law or decree, depending on the political arrangement in a country, sets the framework and boundaries for all local content practitioners. This is better than directives or policies that are subject to speculation or compliance on best endeavor basis. In Nigeria, we started with a policy. I was working for Shell, and Shell, to be fair, tried to push those policies to see how far it would take them. But when it got to a particular point, they turn around and say there is no legal basis to implement what you are asking, because it was a policy. In Nigeria, we have the Logic Act 2010 in place. It is no longer optional or debatable whether to comply with local content requirements. The Act establishes the Nigerian Content Development and Monitoring Board as the sole agency for local content implementation in the oil and gas industry. Of course, it is an independent regulatory body, just like said by some of the panel members. In fact, the new Petroleum Act fully reinforces the practice of local content in the industry and has further extended the remit of oversight of the Local Content Board to the approvals of field development plans, so that local content consideration are taken into consideration from inception. And I think Ranti made the point. The fields we are talking about are almost 250 kilometers offshore Namibia. Most of us will not see those activities. It will happen 250 kilometers. Some of the services will be procured from where they have established logistic bases. You will only hear that these gentlemen that work in the oil and gas industry took helicopter flights to the airport and went back to their countries. You will not see anything because it's 250 kilometers offshore Namibia. One of the provisions of the NOGIC Act is that first consideration shall be given to Nigerian operators in the award of blocks and licenses, Nigerian goods and services, and the employment and training of Nigerians. We have deployed these provisions in the law to ensure that patronage of Nigerian business with the requisite capacity to deliver. Similarly, we have used it to create sizable number of indigenous operators from regular bid rounds and asset divestment by international oil companies. A typical example is a company we call Seplat. When they acquired the asset that was left by Shell, it was producing 10,000 barrels per day. But an indigenous company, 99% Nigerians, took that asset. Today, they are aiming to produce 100,000 barrels per day. However, some of the key lessons under the regulatory environment parameters are as follows. The law must promote and enable investments rather than become a stumbling block to existing or new investors, both locally and internationally. No law is perfect. Put the law in place and amend the law as necessary rather than waiting to get everyone's buy-in. It took us more than 15 years to put in place the Petroleum Act 2021, yet we already have some stakeholders agitating for its amendment. Provision should be made in the law to address any lacuna without having to review the entire law, such as the provision of the NOGIC Act for utilization of ministerial regulations to address any gaps or opportunities. You will never get a perfect law. Don't wait for it. While the law may not necessarily be all-encompassing, consideration should be given to its linkage to other key sectors of the economy rather than just oil and gas. As a regulator, you must be pragmatic in applying the law, as the oil and gas industry is very dynamic, such that aspirational goals and prevailing realities are not always the same in the same trajectory. The second parameter of sustainable world-class local content practice is gap analysis. It is often said that if you cannot measure it, you cannot control it. Baseline and periodic gap analysis are essential to determine gaps that are needed to be closed in the area of skills, facilities, and infrastructure. Regular reviews and monitoring of local content goals show where capacities have been met, where there are gaps, and where capacity upgrade is required to guide the deployment of resources and investment decisions. Let me highlight that this parameter is very key, especially for new players in the oil and gas industry such as Namibia. The gaps to be closed must be driven by local circumstance aspirations. It is human capacity development, employment, development of local service industries, infrastructure, local manufacture, or put in place sovereign wealth fund. Let me highlight that local content is not a one-size-fits-all. What is applicable in Brazil, what is applicable in Nigeria or in Norway is not what you can cut and paste in Namibia. It has to be context-driven. You have to study the environment before you come up with a local content law that is applicable to Namibia. A lot of people say, oh, go and look at Norway example. Go and look at example in Qatar. When I was asked by Shell to develop a strategy for Qatar local content when I was in the Middle East, I went there and they told me to say, look, our problem is not about employment. 2.6 million people with this kind of GDP, we're not looking for employment. But our own local content is how all manufacturing concerns will be domiciled in Qatar and not anywhere else. That's their own local content challenge. Well, I've been pushed a time of timing. Unfortunately, I spent 2 days getting to Namibia. And if I can't finish what I prepared, then it is very sad. For us in Nigeria, we set aspirational targets as contained in the schedule of the Local Content Act. The Notic Act has set minimum targets in 278 service categories across oil and gas value chain to enhance participation of local businesses in the oil and gas supply chain and its linkage sector. 6 years ago, we launched a 10-year strategic roadmap to move Nigerian content in the oil and gas sector to 70% by the year 2027. Based on our monitoring of the industry, we have moved Nigerian content from less than 5% when we started in 2010 to 54% as at the end of 2022. Various strategic initiatives are being implemented to ensure that the goal is achieved. Key lessons we have learned as regards the gap analysis parameters are follows. It is good to have baseline data, if available, in-country capacity and capabilities to identify the existing gaps and set the targets for gap closure. There is need to strike a balance between aspirational goals and realistic target setting. Both are important in driving investment, motivation, and taking cognizance of local peculiarities. Put in place credible action plans and initiatives to close gaps identified, all driven and tracked by a functional project management office. All gaps cannot be closed overnight, even if you have the resource to do it. Prioritize areas of high impact and deploy prudent implementation measures. Put in place some legal instrument to protect and give effect to the goals you choose to pursue. Some have it as royal decrees, act of parliament, or even written in their constitution. Parameter number 3, which is capacity building. Structured capacity building intervention is essential to spur the development of in-country capacities and capabilities. These are largely driven intervention to close identified gaps in human capacity development, local business development, as well as national development. Since the Act came into effect, we have developed 2 world-class pipe mills and 5 pipe coating plants, grown fabrication capacity from less than 5,000 metric tons per annum to 250,000 metric tons per annum, and have capacity to carry out over 80% of engineering design in-country. We have created 30,000 direct jobs, delivered over 15 million training man-hours, and awarded over 90% of contracts to Nigerian-owned businesses, utilized expatriate management system to ensure more than 80% of our oil company management positions are held by Nigerians.